To fully understand the context between Zechariah being struck mute and receiving his voice back at this time in our gospel today, it is, I think, helpful to understand a little bit about that cultural context of the Israelite people and of that cultural experience or understanding that the father, the ancestors, are so important and considered as, in many ways, to be honored and to be respected. And there's always that understanding that you are to honor your ancestors, especially through that male heritage, your father, your grandfather, and so on down the line. And so much so that it becomes almost impossible for them to imagine or to see the child, the descendant, not paying that homage or not in some ways by their life and their accomplishments giving honor to their ancestors. It is almost more in line with that thought than that person is doing it for themselves or anything along those lines. So to see and understand when Zechariah's voice is taken from him, by the angel, the angel says, you don't believe me, you don't trust my words, therefore you will not be able to speak until the child is born. It is, in many ways, expressing that John is something unique. That John the Baptist is not just proclaiming the words of his father or his ancestors, that John is the voice of God. And for that to become clear to the Jewish people, the angel takes the very literal voice of Zechariah and silences him, so that John can be that voice of God, not of his ancestors, but the voice truly of the divine, that voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the paths of the Lord. This distinction is so important to understand John's ministry, and not least of which to make that comparison between Zechariah and John to Joseph and Jesus. As you remember in our homilies or deacon's homily this last week, he spoke about how Joseph doesn't have any lines of dialogue, any spoken pieces in the Gospels, for much that same principle, that Joseph is silent and remains silent so that the ministry of Jesus does not get overshadowed and doesn't confuse or muddy that water between Jesus and his ancestors. And Jesus points out this reality as well when he speaks with the Pharisees and he asks them, how can David say of the Messiah, the one who is to come, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand? How can David say to the Messiah, who is to be the descendant of David, my Lord? And the Pharisees would have said, this is pretty much impossible. David could never say to one of his descendants, my Lord, because the descendant must always say back to David, my Lord. And so the Pharisees would not really be able to understand this. They would not be able to make sense of that contradiction or that dilemma. Either the Messiah is the son of David, or he's not, and if he is, then how can he call David the Lord? If he's not the son of the David, then it creates those other issues. And the response Jesus gives is pretty simple, because he is saying, yes, he is physically the descendant of David, but he is also fully divine. He is man and God. And that is why David can say of the Messiah, my Lord. This distinction is so important because, that ministry of Jesus stands in a different context, not in that same line of ancestors. Although he is truly the son of David by the flesh, he is understandably divine. And his ministry, his voice stands apart. As we hear these passages, we are reminded of the role that we are also called to play and to see in John the Baptist, to see in that ministry of Christ something different, something unique, something greater than anything else that came before. And we are to add our voices to theirs, not to prop up ourselves, not to say that we are more important, but to point towards something greater, something that is divine, something that is unique in all of human history, so that it might be that expression of faith. And by that faith, by that humble submission, not to ourselves, but to God, we might be saved through that same God who has humbled himself to come to us.